Quick, before this video starts, we're gonna play a little word association game. Close your eyes and tell me, what do you think of when I say survival horror? Well, it's kinda obvious what I'm gonna say if you click on this video, so it should be already in your mind. Resident Evil is the game that coined the term survival horror. This over 20-year-old franchise has risen to the top of the genre, gotten stale, reinvented itself, got stale again, reinvented itself again. Selling over 75 million copies, it's probably one of the most influential game franchises, inspiring countless series and directly spawning two whole genres of games. Yeah, you can say that Resident Evil is very influential. After moving further and further away from its horror roots to satisfy the heightening of AAA video game budgets and making more and more titles that Capcom thinks would appeal to a mainstream audience, Resident Evil has seemingly scaled down. Shown back in E3 2016 as a first-person title that many people compared to Konami's PT, which was a playable teaser for the cancelled Silent Hills. While previous games in the franchise actually spawned game genres, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, well, seems to be borrowing more from the indie horror scene. How will the newest game hold up after 24 titles, 6 live-action movies, countless comic books, 3 animated films, 7 novels, and just a crazy amount of merchandise? Well, we'll find out as we take a look at this series from the very beginning. This is the Resident Evil Retrospective.
Resident Evil.
The very first horror games could be put into these two categories, either text-based Lovecraftian horror or horror-themed games that could really barely be called horror games. I mean, I find it really hard for this to be scary. No, not Otto. No! Otto! It just took a while for people to attempt to take the horror genre seriously, and those first attempts was the highly influential title Sweet Home. Based on the film of the same name, Sweet Home was a horror RPG, released only in Japan on the Famicom, or Nintendo for you Americans. The game, just like the movie, followed a team of documentary filmmakers trying to recover famous paintings from an abandoned mansion. And well, it turned out this mansion was haunted. They become trapped and they must fight their way out of the mansion while figuring out what the mystery is behind the mansion. Does that plot sound too familiar? Well, Sweet Home took the usual JRPG structure and made what many to consider the first horror game, but this one had a twist: permadeath. If someone died, they stayed dead. This made the game actually really scary, in both mechanically and in its presentation. Unfortunately, this game would never come to America, and thus the first true American horror game was this little title called Alone in the Dark. Whether or not Infogrames saw Sweet Home or not, it wasn't really clear. But what was clear was that the game was really influential. Calling its brand of horror ambient horror. Ooh, that's a weird title. Ambient horror. Alone in the Dark's gameplay should be familiar to any fans of the Resident Evil series. The fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls really seem like an early prototype of the Resident Evil games. The production of Resident Evil was a very interesting one indeed. Capcom tapped the yet-to-be-proven worthy Shinji Mikami to make the remake of Sweet Home that would be marketed to a worldwide audience for this time. The thing is that Shinji Mikami wasn't really known for anything of this caliber. He only had been making licensed Disney games for Capcom, but many would soon find that this risk would pay off. In the very early stages of production, Resident Evil was planned to be a first-person shooter with real-time rendered environments, but that was quickly scrapped as the PlayStation couldn't really handle FPS games, well, at the time at least. Also, the Japanese market was not really used to first-person games at the time. Mikami then discovered a little title called Alone in the Dark. He had found his perspective. Now, Mikami had to theme the game. Capcom no longer had the rights to Sweet Home, and now a new plot had to be designed. Mikami later stated in a 2014 interview that the original plan was more psychological. The enemies were supernatural spectra, and the whole experience he likened to the movie Paranormal Activity. He realized that there wasn't enough action, so zombies. Mikami then took many inspirations from pop culture. The house was designed after the hotel in The Shining. The zombies, a page out of the book of George Romero. A cooperative mode was designed, but later scrapped. Also, some of the first character designs featured a different cast with a different, more cartoonish style. There was Dewey, who was set to be the comic relief, and Geltzer, the tankish, brutish type. But they were scrapped for a more realistic aesthetic, something that, well, was aimed for with the story as well, but yeah. Just looking at this intro cinematic says that they kind of messed up with that. To be fair, the developers didn't really want to include it in the game. The actors for the intro cinematic were the first American actors that they could find and were chosen for their looks and not really their acting abilities. The actors were only stated on a first name basis, making them really hard to find for fans to try to track down. Well, but they were later pretty much found, except for, well, fortunately, there hasn't been a consensus on who Jill Valentine is, which is kind of sad that we don't know who she actually was. According to Mikami, Jill was just a high school girl, but we may never know who she truly is. And it's kind of really sad because you really want to know the story behind this production. The whole intro really grinds against the rest of the game. This really cheesy horror thing that goes
Jill Valentine.
Yeah, not really the best way to start your slowly paced atmospheric horror game. What is this? What? The game was originally planned to have Japanese acting for the Japanese version, but yeah, according to Mikami, they sucked. The thing is that because of a language barrier, Mikami and the crew didn't really know that the English voice acting sucked as well. Also, some of the dialogue seems like they were put through Google Translate a couple times.
Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things.
All this considered, Resident Evil was released in Japan under its original name, Biohazard. It's box art coining the genre survival horror. For the American and European releases, Capcom realized that a trademark for Biohazard couldn't be attained in America, so a competition was held for a new title. That title would be, well, isn't really obvious, Resident Evil. A name that I vastly prefer over that of Biohazard. Resident Evil keep the mystery in the title. Biohazard really tips the hat to what the game is really about and is pretty cold and distant and scientific, which kind of really takes out all the mystery in the game. Resident Evil was picked as the non-Japanese title, a direct callback to the house of residing evil in Sweet Home. But enough about all of this development mumbo-jumbo. What about the game? Resident Evil begins with that intro that totally grinds with the actual game. You play as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, members of the elite task force stars sent to investigate the disappearance of Bravo Team. Bravo Team sent to the Arklay Mountains, a place that doesn't exist. Trust me, I checked. It's supposed to be in the Midwestern United States. They were sent to the Arklay Mountains to investigate some recent disappearances, but were never heard from again. Alpha Team, upon reaching the downed helicopter, gets ambushed by zombie dogs and abandoned by their helicopter and forced to take refuge in the House of Residing Evil. Whereupon Chris and Jill are separated. Involves the remnants of Alpha Team, finding survivors, exploring the mansion, and uncovering its secrets, and getting the hell out of there. And the story for the game is, serviceable at least, at the best. I'm not totally against terrible acting in horror. It actually works in some circumstances, kind of making everything feel a little bit off. But the problem here with the acting isn't really that it's bad, it's just actually worked here. It goes on this birdemic level of bad acting that it makes the whole game into a comedy. The writing really doesn't help it either.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life. But Barry, didn't you say you're going back to the dining room to do some research? Why on earth are you here?
I just had something I wanted to check. Now, let's get back to searching for the lost captain and Chris, shall we?
Though a lot of the text really is ominous and is generally well written and unnerving for some reason, though they couldn't get the actual dialogue right. The main plot of a mysterious house that turns out to be this research center for this immoral biomedical company is serviceable. I think it lets on too early really what's going on with the zombies with lab coats and the text entries that refer to sciencey stuff. Turns out Umbrella Corporation was doing evil sciencey stuff on animals and stuff, and well, it created a virus called the T-Virus, and this biological super soldier, which totally listens to commands. It doesn't. Well, that is the game. It gets really interesting at this moment. The leader of Bravo Team tells your character that there's a traitor amongst Alpha Team, and is subsequently assassinated by an unseen killer. And then you're like, oh, what? Who is it? Oh, but not really. Oh, it's really obviously evil guy with a very evil-sounding name, Wesker, who was planning to get all the stars killed and cover up the whole T-Virus thing. Wesker gets killed by this super soldier tyrant thingy. You escape, game over. Or at least depending on the ending you got. Yeah, and that is another callback to Sweet Home. Resident Evil has multiple endings, which vary from you save mostly everybody to only yourself, the mansion still intact, and the tyrant roaming the forest. You know, that's nice and all, but what about the gameplay? Well, it surprisingly holds up better than its contemporaries from that time. Almost every single piece of the gameplay holds up the game and causes for some interesting game decisions. Limited item space causes one to be savvy and think about weapon, ammunition, healing items, puzzle pieces, keys, and save tokens to carry with you from store box to store box. Saves are tied to ink ribbons, which causes for more decision making. Should I use a ink ribbon now or try to move to the next typewriter and use it then? Saving sooner rather than later means that you might not have ink ribbons for the harder parts of the game, where you might want to save more often. Saving later might cause you more to have to deal with the hassles immediately, as you might still have to deal with dangerous monsters in the hallways, meaning more opportunities where you'd die and you'd end up further back than if you had saved originally. It's just really brilliant, that tug of war of ideas. Just the simple interaction with an enemy is interesting through the limited ammo count, limited healing items, stiff controls. Every encounter becomes these very deliberate and planned affairs. What weapon are you going to use? If you're going to use a weapon at all, or just run past the enemy, this is a healing item now or later. It really makes the gameplay really calculated. The fact that most of the enemies go down in 6 to 8 shots, which is almost half of one clip, makes bullet management a really misleading endeavor. You might think to yourself, well, I have all these bullets, but in all actuality you don't. It makes it so tense. Though I kind of really prefer that there was more of a buffer between bites. Sometimes these zombies could effectively stun lock you if you're not careful. Getting bit by one zombie, pushing that zombie off, and then then immediately getting bitten by another zombie seems to be way too unfair. The puzzles in this game are actually too easy. I feel they're actually way too simple for me. Most of them involve just plugging up a hole or activating a switch. This one is kind of interesting. You get to hit these switches in the order of the age of these paintings, or else these birds will attack you if you get it wrong. This one actually caused me to pull out a pen and paper. I'm kind of being nitpicky here, but I kind of wish that these puzzles were a tad more difficult. I understand that you don't want them to be too hard, but I mean, they're too easy as well. Why have them? Also, it's really far-fetched that these scientists would have these really complicated ways to activate an elevator or any of this stuff, but hey, it's a video game or whatnot, you know? But I'm kind of would have preferred if it made sense. I don't have a problem with backtracking, but the backtracking in this game gets kind of laborious. And it's really lengthy and just really dull. Some of these puzzle pieces are really spread out to almost like comical distance. One thing that this game does pretty well is having some pretty diverse enemies that attack in different ways, well, except for the bosses. For the most part, what you want to do for these is run from one side of the room to shoot, run to the other side, shoot, rinse, repeat, which is kind of sad because a lot of the other enemies in the game are just so good. From the generic zombies that can still pack a bite, the hunters who jump up and force the air, forcing you very slowly turn around and to get them. Thankfully, the lock-on is very generous, or else this would seem very broken. The game is actually also very highly replayable, giving people a key when you beat the game that opens a door that cannot be accessed the first time through and effectively unlocks a new costume. Beat the game in under 3 hours, you'll be rewarded with the rocket launcher. There's also different scripted sequences that play out differently depending on what you do. The original Resident Evil surprisingly still holds up and still feels like a breath of fresh air even today. Really a testament that good game design stands the test of time. Unlike these graphics though, that really don't hold up. I mean, the pre-rendered backgrounds look great, but the characters appear as if they don't really belong there, as if they're being green screened in on some kind of amateur project. Part of it has to do with the low graphics, lack of furnishings in the house, no dynamic shadows on the character models, but hey, this was cutting edge for the time. It just doesn't really hold up today. But yeah, I mean, I'd recommend playing this if it wasn't for a certain remake, if that didn't exist. But I'll talk about that later. The game is still pretty scary, and this jump scare really gets me most of the time. All the time, actually. The producer for Resident Evil, Tokuro Fujiwara, said that the game was only planned to be a one-off game that would be a niche cult title. Well, yeah, that's obviously not true what happened. The game went on to sell millions. They had a surprise hit on their hands, and also a sequel was announced, but later delayed. So, a year and a half after the release of the original, Capcom released a director's cut to satiate fans and also give fans a taste of the new game to come. This was also planned to have the cutscenes back in it. From the American version of the Resident Evil, a couple of gore shots were cut from the intro, and this shot of Chris smoking a cigarette, because the real horror is stage 4 lung cancer. The thing is that that famous localization team probably somehow missed the memo again. Even though on the box it said that it had the cutscenes, but it really didn't. Yeah, oops. The director's cut had a rearranged version of the mansion that moved items around to keep players on their toes. And a year after that, a DualShock version was released that had a new soundtrack that was very, suspect. The soundtrack was redone by the Japanese Beethoven Mamoru Samuraguchi, who was known to be deaf at the time, but then, oh wait, turns out he's a quack who had a ghostwriter this whole time and, well, wasn't really actually deaf, just hearing impaired. I mean, if you're gonna get a ghostwriter, shouldn't you actually get a good one? It doesn't really actually matter because, well, they brought us this soundtrack. And next time, we'll see if the series continues to thrive under a new director.